Well, I do like Mondays, and I'll tell you why. It's because of Mishnah Mondays, which we've just restarted. Really happy to be with you all. It's a great way to start the week with some of this, what I've been calling kind of crunchy Jewish knowledge. All right, like when we meet together, if you on Thursdays, if you come to my Parsha class, it's like it's just beautiful storytelling, mystery, philosophy. Mishnah is like, how did Judaism work back then? What were all of the customs, the laws? How did that society function? And so it's and we get philosophy and storytelling along the way, but this is the beginning of Jewish law. Well, the Torah is the beginning of Jewish law, but this is the beginning of a tradition of interpreting the laws of the Torah and adding to them and legislating around them and trying to figure out how first of all, we're trying to figure out how Jews lived back then in the time of late antiquity. The Mishnah emerges in the beginning of the 3rd century of the Common Era, but they're trying to figure out. And I'm saying this because we took a long break. So I gave a little introduction last time, just like even shorter this week. But for those of us who are just joining, what we're trying to figure out is what was it that the rabbis were proposing as a new way of living after the destruction of the temple, and a kind of a total reconfiguration of Jewish society, Jewish practice, Jewish life, now that it wasn't centered around a nation and a court and a temple and the infrastructures of a sovereign society, right? So this is the beginning of the diasporic Judaism. This is the beginning of the Judaism of study and practice. Okay, so that's part of what the Mishnah is. Okay, we picked up where we left off. We took a year off, and we picked up where we left off in the middle of one of the largest volumes of the Mishnah, this rabbinic code, and that is we had finished the first order of the Mishnah, which is the agricultural laws, and then we began the second order of the Mishnah, which is maybe the most beloved order of the Mishnah, because it's the holidays. It's Moed, the various holidays and discussion of the laws of the holidays, which continue to shape our Jewish lives in such a deep and profound way, right? The Jewish calendar is one of the central institutions and rhythms and structures our practice out here in the world of wandering. So the holidays, and we'll move through slowly. We don't look at every Mishnah, but the important ones and the highlights and the fun ones, trying to get a sense of what's in here. We begin our discussion with the most important Jewish holiday, which is Shabbat. Shabbat it's almost not a holiday because it comes every week, and yet it is the supreme holiday. And not just because it is the most important and it is mentioned in the first chapter of the Torah, but also because so many of the other laws of the holidays we learned from Shabbat. Shabbat is sort of the holiday paradigm. Okay. Today, we are going to take a look at an important principle in the practice of Shabbat, and it actually ends up being just a massively important principle in Jewish life altogether. I'm going to say it in Hebrew first, because it's so important that even though they are unfamiliar words, the phrase is sometimes familiar to folks even who haven't studied much rabbinic literature. And the phrase is pikuach nefesh. You heard the phrase pikuach nefesh, right? Pikuach nefesh means literally like attending to, or you would translate it as saving a life. Pikuach nefesh. And the principle is pikuach nefesh doche et Shabbat. Saving a life literally pushes aside, but saving a life overrides Shabbat. Okay, that's the principle, and we're gonna spend some time figuring out not just how that works, but also the larger question of, wait, so what pushes us? How can Shabbat be pushed aside, and what constitutes a permitted violation of Shabbat, because after all, Shabbat is both the active mitzvot of making kiddush, but there aren't that many active mitzvot. A lot of what Shabbat is about what we call negative mitzvot, not doing, right? All of the laws of not doing. And just before we closed and broke for a year, we looked at, there were 39 actions that we are prohibited to do. And the idea of pikuach nefesh is, if a life is at stake, you can do them anyway. Okay, that's the simple version. You heard of this general principle? Yeah, a lot of people have. It's a very hallmark principle in Jewish law, because it is not just important to know it, but also because it represents something fundamental about our religion. And I'm soon going to turn and ask you to articulate what is that? What is that principle behind pikuach nefesh? But let's take a look at where it comes from. Pikuach nefesh is learned from, you might think it's just, as one of my friends and teachers, Rabbi Bnei Lapi would say, it's just svara. It's just like, it's intuitive. Of course, you don't die for Shabbat, but it's not so obvious at all. And so it is learned out of a verse. Okay, let me give you a source sheet. And then I'm going to show you the verse. I'm going to show you the source for pikuach nefesh, and then I want us to talk out a little bit. Okay, so what is the principle exactly? Why is this so important to us? So let's take a look here. Okay, you have that all in the chat, and let's take a look. It's learned from a verse in Leviticus. Ushamartem et chukotai vet mishpatai asher yaseh otam ha'adam v'chai b'hem. And that's this phrase here, v'chai b'hem. Ani Hashem is important. You shall keep my laws and my rules, by the pursuit of which human beings shall live. Ani Hashem, I am the eternal. Okay, so obviously, in the kind of regular reading of such a verse, you would say, we are to live by these customs. These will shape the order and the rhythm of our lives. But because the interpreters of the Torah, the rabbis, are always wondering about the need for every single phrase. Well, of course, if you keep them, you're gonna live by them. So what they understand is v'chai b'hem, and the human being shall live by them, v'chai b'hem, and the Talmud says v'lo yamut b'hem, and not die by them. Okay, clearly, if the Torah says you shall live by them, it means, although it's not so clear, it's not necessarily an obvious read, but it means that in keeping my laws and rules, you should be able to live. No observance of the religion should force you to die. That's it. That's where it comes from. And that the interpretation of that verse. And then there is an explicit articulation of the principle of pikuach nefesh, pushing aside Shabbat in particular. It's the most famous expression of pikuach nefesh. And that actually is in the Mishnah as well, but we have to jump forward. It strangely appears in the Mishnah not strangely, but you'll see how it appears in the Mishnah for Yom Kippur, the Mishnah called Yom Kippur. And this is part of why I think it's so important to study the Mishnah. Is you just like, it's the core, the first articulation of some of these basic principles. So the first articulation of pikuach nefesh dochet Shabbat, saving a life overrides Shabbat, is the following. It comes up in Yom Kippur, and saving a life overrides Yom Kippur as well. If someone is seized with bulmus, and bulmus apparently, the commentators say, is a disease that caused unbearable hunger and impaired vision. But it's especially important that it causes unbearable hunger because it's Yom Kippur, and you're not supposed to eat on Yom Kippur, but you can feed that person on Yom Kippur if he has bulmus, and you can even feed him treif. If all that's around is bacon, because after all the Jewish stores are closed, feed him bacon. Now, this may sound like obvious to you now, but they needed to state it as a principle, because after all, it's Yom Kippur. It's the holiest day of the year. You might think, Yom Kippur, it's just one day a year, and if something happens, too bad. You just have to suffer through it, or maybe die, but we died for God. That's an idea, isn't it? In some religion, died for God. But no, you should feed him and even feed him treif. All right. And then while we're discussing that, some other laws, and I included them all because there's sort of a fun discussion, or not fun, but funny, interesting. If someone was bit by a mad dog, I retranslated it. Yeah. By a mad dog, one may not feed him from the lobe of the dog's liver, but Rabbi Matya ben Harash permits. Now, what is that about? Well, there's clearly some debate there over. There's a folk tradition that if you take off some of the dog's liver, then you'll be cured. Hair of the dog that bit you, you know what I mean? It's like sort of one of the original formulations of hair of the dog. The part of the dog will cure you. But most of the rabbis are like, that's not true. that's not good science. But Rabbi Matya ben Harash says, who knows? If it's even possible that it might help, well, then you can eat that. Anything that any precaution you need to take, there's no debating. Rabbi Matya argues, maybe this will work, maybe this won't work. Any possibility for saving a life pushes aside Yom Kippur, and then comes Shabbat while we're talking about it. This same Rabbi Matya ben Harash, he's the first really great articulator of Pikuach Nefesh. And remember, he's the one who's even willing to take folk remedies, anything that is. And you think about folk remedies, you might think, you might be able to go to the hospital, but you can't do acupuncture because that's, nope. Lots of different theories on what heals. We'll take them all. Okay, that's sort of what's going on here. And now we'll see Shabbat come along. And Rabbi Matya ben Harash says, if someone suffers pain in his throat, one may place a medicine inside his mouth on Shabbat, because there is uncertainty whether or not it is a life-threatening situation. And any case of uncertainty concerning a life-threatening situation overrides Shabbat. Here's the line, and it's an important one. V'chol safek nefashot doche, pushes aside et Shabbat. You might wonder, by the way, what's the problem with taking a medicine? And we're not going to get too deep into how Shabbat would be violated with all these things, but cooking a medicine, doing whatever it takes to make crushing a medicine, right? So puncturing the skin. We'll try not to get too entangled in the precise violations, but the point is you can violate Shabbat. Okay, so now let me ask you, the principle is now clear enough, and I think we probably like it. We're used to it. I think of it as a noble principle within our tradition. But why? What is the principle? Life is important? Okay, but speak it out. Why can you might well think, look, it's Shabbat. You're supposed to rest. It's God's law. And if something happens, it happens. That's just the way it is. And you'll go to heaven or whatever it is, but what can you articulate the principle for me? So Florine is gonna lead us here.
Actually, it's a different question, but maybe it will lead to it. Where does the concept of rodef come from? Because we know that if the embryo is possibly causing the death of the mother, it's pursuing the mother, so to speak, then she may have an abortion.
That's right.
Aren't these similar in the same kind of mentality?
Well, that's interesting because, like, the case you're describing, whether it's funny because the fetus is called sort of loosely a rodef, a pursuer, and therefore the fetus can be aborted in order to save the life of the mother, on the principle that if a rodef, a pursuer, like a murderer, is chasing someone, you can kill the murderer in self-defense. That's the way that law gets told. That's the language they use. It is obviously a related conversation in that the preservation of life is paramount. And in this case, the fetus is not considered a full life in the way that the mother's life is. It's also true that a murderer has or an attempted murderer has forfeited their life, but it is different than our case it's related, and it echoes this principle of the sacredness of saving life, but it's different because there's not a religious law that you would be violating in order to save that life. Okay, so I guess the religious law of killing altogether. So it is. I totally accept that it's related, but also quite distinct. All right, Ariella.
Well, to me, it just shows in the Jewish religion that the sanctity of life paramounts everything else, including Shabbat. Okay.
There we go. The articulation seems that Ariella is giving us is that the principle here is that within the religious system, within the values that undergird this system, the preservation of life is one of our religious values. Its life itself is paramount and sacrosanct. And so it's not that we pause the religion in order to save a life, but that is the religion, or that is the law, because of some value that this all, and that after all, Ariella is just interpreting the verse in Leviticus like the rabbis did, right? These laws are supposed to promote life, but it isn't just the technicality like, and so if they promote death, you can't do them. But no, that's the point of the whole system, to promote and allow for the flourishing of life. I realize we haven't said a blessing yet, and we usually say a blessing, but we're gonna take a break after we understand this principle, and then we'll head into some other applications of pushing aside Shabbat. But let's hear from the folks who have their hands up. Rabbi Zaki.
Thank you. I was just reflecting on a Mishnah class that I studied years ago about a rabbi that was leading the congregation but arrived late, and they wanted to know why he was late, because at that time it was a he. And he actually carried wood into somebody's home to keep them warm, to keep them from dying from the cold. And that makes me think about carrying the wood, and it was Shabbat, and it was all that.
Good. Another application of the principle, we are told in the Talmud that you can light a fire to provide warmth and comfort to a person who is ailing. The person has to be ailing in a serious way, but it isn't just, I need to take that medicine or I'm going to die, but also whatever it takes to promote the well-being and the life of a person who is really suffering a life-threatening illness. And you can extend this principle in all kinds of ways, right? Like, it ends up meaning not just that you can have the surgery, but that you can drive to the hospital, right? And I will say that a lot of our thinking at IKAR around videoing our services during the pandemic was founded on this understanding that if people need to stay at home because they are suffering from a life-threatening illness, or in this case, like a life-threatening attack to their immunity, so there are lots of things you can do to provide them comfort and sustenance. So we could have that conversation another time. How far do you go with this principle? But that's the general principle. Okay, let me take a couple more comments from Marianka and then Hal.
Hi. So I think the life aspect has to do with creation. God is the creator of life, right? So and the other factor is that we are created in God's image. So preserving a life is preserving God's creation, in other words.
Good. Now we're into real theology here, and also Marianka's doing a really good, solid reading of the Torah. Before there's any law, there's the creation of this being that is created in God's image. There's creation of all forms of being, of nefesh chaya, a living being. That's the first thing God intended. So yeah, there are laws later, but they're not the starting place. The starting place is that life should exist and thrive, right? Once we have laws, it's like those laws can't override what seems to be God's original intention, which is to bring life into the world. Hal?
Okay. Yeah. So if my memory is correct, I think that Joe Lieberman used this principle when he was senator to do government business on Shabbat because, he was, I guess, a practicing Orthodox Jew. And, he still walked to the Capitol. He lived close enough to do that. But when the situation demanded it, this principle was able to sort of allow him to engage. So.
Okay, good. I didn't know that was his reasoning, but it's a good example of the conversation I was just alluding to. How far can we take this principle? You will see as almost a standard that doctors will wear an alert, like a beeper, a pager on Shabbat. So observant Jewish doctors wear a pager because should they be needed, absolutely, they have to go and take care of someone. So now, can you extend that to a politician who is, after all, looking after the well-being of lives, right? So that's a good example of how of one of the questions here, which is how far can we take this principle? Okay, but I want to ask another question for today, because after all, we're following along in the Mishnah in order. And what the other question I want to ask today, because remember, we had to jump to a new volume of Mishnah to get that principle that any risk of life overrides Shabbat. But in Masechet Shabbat, in Tractate Shabbat itself, we don't get that principle yet, but we do get other examples of things that push aside Shabbat. And that's really actually going to be our focus today. So we know the principle of pikuach nefesh dochet Shabbat, that saving a life overrides Shabbat. What else might override Shabbat? And we're going to get a few examples in our Mishnah today. Okay, so let's finally, that was all a very long introduction. So let's just say a blessing over our Torah study today. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay. So here now, let's see where the idea that you can break Shabbat. There's a lot of discussion of, well, what does it take to break Shabbat? We were looking at that last week. Is this a violation of Shabbat, or is this a violation? Can you go this far, or can you go this far within the discussion of the laws themselves? But this is different. This law is not, oh, it's okay to do this within the law, but actually it's okay to break the law for this purpose. And the first example of it is quite striking, maybe quite surprising. Okay, Kol Kitvei HaKodesh, all sacred writings, that's the Torah and the books of the prophets. One may rescue them from the fire on Shabbat, whether they are read on Shabbat or not. Okay, meaning we don't read the entire Tanakh, the entire Hebrew Bible on Shabbat. We read from the Torah, we read from the books of the prophets, and we read the Megillot sometimes, but we don't read we don't read from the book of Proverbs on Shabbat. We don't read from the book of Job on Shabbat. But the statement here is all sacred writings, one may rescue them from the fire on Shabbat, whether they are read on Shabbat or not. Okay. And then there's like there's another thought that seems related, but the Talmud is not sure exactly how, because then it says, even though they were written in another language, they require burial. Okay. But before we go there, let's just start with sacred writings. If there's a fire, and you're not allowed to put out a fire on Shabbat. You're not allowed to start a fire, not allowed to put out a Shabbat. But you need to put out the fire in order to save a Sefer Torah, like a book of the Torah scroll. Now, we know those are expensive and valuable and sacred. I know. It's really important, but it's not a life. It's not a life. It's Shabbat. It's a disaster, but should you really be able to put out a fire in order to save a Sefer Torah? Why? Someone have any sense of why would we be able to save holy books on Shabbat? Yeah, Leah Matsui.
It's the tree of life.
Good. Okay, that comment is quite enough. She says it all in just a phrase. It's Chaim Hi. But that's a deep thing to say. The Sefer Torah, instead of saying, well, it's also really important, so we can also break Shabbat for it. No, maybe it operates along the same principle. Torah is the source of life. The Torah is like a living being. We rise for the Torah. We bury the Torah when it becomes unusable. So it's like a life. It's like a life. Okay, that's well said. And speaking of burying the Torah, there was that second phrase there, right? Even if it's not written in Hebrew, even if it's written in English, a translation, Greek, Syrian, it requires burial. Now, the rabbis of the Talmud are not sure whether this is just another law that we're saying along the way, or whether that means that even an English Torah can be saved from a fire on Shabbat. Okay, meaning we know that a Torah scroll written in Hebrew can be saved from the fire on Shabbat, and what we're saying is all sacred writings translated or original need burial. Is it also true that even a Torah written in Greek or English can be saved from the fire on Shabbat? Now, what's at stake in that debate? What's the difference between saying, well, we can save a Sefer Torah, but not a translation? And then this other opinion would suggest, no, you could even save a translation of a Torah you put out a fire, you break Shabbat in order to save this French Torah, this English Torah, this Greek Torah. Is there anybody want to speak out? What are the stakes there? What's the difference between only the Torah and Torah in translation also?
The holy language.
Good, right. Marianka says maybe it's about the sacred script. There's certain things that are so sacred that it's like they're like a living being. The Torah scroll with its precise and the aleph and the bet and the way that God intended, that can be saved. Or is it like anything that is sacred, anything that is Torah, anything that explains Torah, anything that goes along with Torah? And the answer is suggested by the end of the Mishnah here. They debate this in the Talmud, but look at the end of the Mishnah. One may rescue the cover for a Torah scroll together with the Torah scroll and a tefillin bag along with the tefillin, even if the tefillin bag has money inside of it, money which you're not supposed to save or touch on Shabbat. So you get the sense that the Torah can be saved on Shabbat, and just like anything that's touched the Torah, anything that has contact with the sacred, now you can break Shabbat for that. Okay, and that's quite an extension of the principle of dochet Shabbat, of pushing aside the Shabbat, not just for a life and not just for a Torah. Okay, a Torah is a special thing, but just sacred objects in general. Okay, so what
about, sorry to interrupt, what about the mezuzah?
Well, that's another debate that they have in the mezuzah would fall under the category of sacred writings, but that in the Talmud there is some debate, and what they end up saying is that if you write out blessings like a siddur, that would not be saved, right? So it has to actually be the Torah or sacred writings, mezuzah, tefillin, those are all scroll writings, and actually it's a great question because the distinction ends up being things that are sacred script, megillot, written on a scroll can be saved, even if they're in translation. But it's not just any kind of Hebrew, and it's not even anything sacred. It's specifically this form of sacred writing. Good clarification. All right, Yonatan, what's your take on all this?
The translation debate and the money debate, to me, has a lot to do with how the rabbis see doubt. What to do when you have doubt about saving a Torah scroll. And they're saying, don't let your doubt stop you from taking this action. And I think this is really the quintessential role of treating the Torah with such reverence. Not that I don't think anybody would think the Torah is as important as a person, right? That's plainly untrue. But we treat it that way, I think, so that we can do this sort of kal v'chomer leap and say, if you would do this for a Torah scroll, you must also do this for a person.
Good, excellent. Yonatan really brings our attention to focus on a word we used earlier, which is safek nefashot. Any life that there's some doubt that perhaps it's in danger, that's enough. And what Yonatan is saying is, it's not just that saving a life overrides the Torah, and then not just that saving a Torah. Sorry, I'm getting tangled in my words. Not just that saving a life overrides Shabbat, and now even saving a Torah overrides Shabbat, but what's important, what the rabbis are kind of legislating us towards, is don't hesitate. Don't hesitate. If there's even a sliver of a doubt that a life is in danger, like, I don't know, maybe the dog's liver will help, give it to him right away. And similarly here, Yonatan says, that's what's going on here. It's not like the bag for the Torah is so important, but you shouldn't stand there and say, well, I don't know. I mean, you could save the Torah, but can you save that? Can you save the yad? And there's money in it. So I don't know. I don't want to touch it. Don't worry about that. Do what's important. Forget about Shabbat right now. Just do it. And so it's the principle is pikuach nefesh, but the rabbinic discussion is meant to push us away from equivocating or hesitating when a life or an eitz chaim, a tree of life, is at stake. Okay, Matt Silberstein.
I also think there's a little bit going on here that I want to use the word magic, but I'm not fully happy with that word. That the thing is somehow so special that, and there was a lot of that with the Torah, is somehow just of itself is this, and I guess maybe that's the tree of life part, but I don't mean the life part. I mean, that is a magical object and we need to treat it special, and maybe I'm wrong, but I'm hearing that as a separate path from save a life.
Okay, that's a completely fair. We very quickly followed Leah with her suggestion that the Torah is like a living being, because that resonates with our reverence for it. But Matt says there's another way to read this, perfectly acceptable reading, which is that there are a number of things which override Shabbat, and human life is surely paramount among them. But there are reasons why we might violate Shabbat, and another reason might be to save a sacred object, something that sacred. It overrides Shabbat. It pushes aside Shabbat. So now we can begin. Matt's question helps us begin to wonder, as we're going to do, well, it isn't just life. What else might override Shabbat? Okay.
And I just have a quick question. Do we save the Talmud? Is that sacred writing?
It's a good question. That's a good question. That's a really good question. We'll see as we move forward what can be saved. According to it's a really good question, because according to what we've just read, you might think, no, not the Talmud, because that's not the Torah nor a translation of it. But isn't the Talmud, after all, a discussion of the Torah? Maybe this YouTube class will be saved on Shabbat, because it's anything that is like come into contact with Torah has to be preserved. So it's a really good question that Matt is asking. I see a new hand up. Esther, hi, nice to see you.
Yeah, hi, there's two of us.
Hi, both of you.
Justin, like, to go back to the conversation, don't doubt, don't wait. There's an interesting conversation again we were talking about the medicine earlier, and there are endless discussions about this treatment. Is this really necessary on Shabbat? Is that really necessary? I remember, because my father's a physician and he dealt with this a lot. So the bottom line always ends up being, okay, first save, and then you can deliberate afterwards about the halachic implications and whether you should have done it or not. First save the person and then worry about it. So that kind of goes down the same path, that don't think about it too much. Just do what feels like needs to be done right now.
Good. Esther, were you going to add to that at all? No. Thank you for that, Esther and Samuel. Thank you for that. So that's good. That's an important extension of what we've been saying. Don't equivocate, don't hesitate. And Samuel reminds us, because it's easy to get lost in the questions of, well, was that really necessary? What exactly can you do here? How far can you? It's the very nature of Talmudic debate to start thinking, well, you could go that far, but not that far. And part of what Samuel is saying is that this is all about saying, don't get into a discussion. Don't get into a debate. Don't think twice about it. Just like forget for a moment. And this really is the kind of meta topic here. What does it mean to suspend your religious obligations? What does it mean to encounter a reality in which suddenly all of the foundation of Jewish practice, this idea that you are obligated, that's all those things are suddenly don't apply. You forget about all of those things. And that's an important principle for us to reflect on and to consider. This entire system operates on the notion that it's too bad if you're hungry. You can't eat non-kosher food, right? You just can't. It's too bad if you really, really want to travel somewhere to wish, to attend a simcha, to pay a visit to the whole thing operates on this idea that you can't simply make exceptions in your religious practice, but here you can. And I want to add an important caveat to that. There are things for which the tradition says you do not make an exception. There are three, we would call them cardinal sins, and it's idolatry, sexual prohibitions like incest, and murder. Right. So if someone, for example, says like, worship this God or else I'll kill you, you should die first. It's sort of like martyrdom. If someone says to you, you should, sleep with your mother or else I'll kill you, that indignity, you should die first. And then in some ways, the most intuitive is if someone says, kill Steve or I'll kill you, you don't kill Steve. That's not a fair equation, right? So there are things. Judaism is not so obsessed with the preservation of life that there's nothing that you should die for. But Shabbat, so central. So in fact, the punishment for the violation of Shabbat in the Torah is death, and yet you can violate it in order to save a life. Okay, so that's sort of where we're at here. Okay, I want to push forward I see a lot of hands up, and that's a good sign, but I want to push forward a little bit just so we have more material to consider, because there are other examples here. And here comes another example that I think is related to life. And we said the Torah is related to life, but surely the Torah, as Yonatan said, is not a life. It's like a life, but it's a step away. Here's another kind of not quite saving a life, but a step away from it. And well, I'm not gonna color it. See what you think. Okay. One may rescue food for 3 meals. You can rescue, the building is burning down. You can go in and get enough food to feed yourself for 3 meals. Now, why 3 meals? And interestingly, they say you can rescue food for 3 meals, like human food for a human and animal food for an animal. So that's already interesting. You can, your thought for your animals is also relevant here. You can put out the fire, you can go rescue, you can risk violating Shabbat in order to get food for 3 meals. Now, why 3 meals? How does this work? If a fire ignited on Friday night, one may rescue food for 3 meals. If a fire ignited in the morning, one may only rescue food for 2 meals. If a fire ignited in the afternoon, one may rescue food for 1 meal. Now we understand, though now we may be troubled, because now the idea is you can not just save a life, but you can save some essentials. but you can only save as much as you need to get through Shabbat. Now, is that a good law? Take a look at Rabbi Yossi softens it a little bit and says, no, you can always rescue 3 meals, at least 3 meals worth you can rescue, but not more than that. You can't, in other words, you can't run into a building and just start taking all of your valuables out. And here is the other end. Here's the extremist Shabbat law. You have to let your house burn down. You have to let your stuff burn down. Lest you thought that this whole rabbinic discussion was just going to be permission, don't worry about it. No, this is quite extreme. You can extract as much as you need to survive for the next day, but only the next day? I mean, and what kind of law is this anyway? I can't eat, I'm not going to starve by the end of the day, right? Okay, so now what's the principle? What's the principle? We could save a life, we can save holy objects, and we can save enough food to take care of us and our animals for the course of this Shabbat. So are we learning something new here? What's this new principle? Okay, I see a lot of hands up. Who wants to jump in? Give me a physical hand. Let's say physical hand. Irene. I'll always call. I try to call on someone who hasn't spoken yet. So
well, I finally got a hand icon where I can raise it after all this time.
Oh goodness. So, okay, good to have you.
So the fire, of course, hits it. That's the first thing I think of when you said you can save a Torah from on Shabbat. And I'm thinking of the wildfires and how we have to grab things. And it's like, so does that mean I have to grab my chumash before I grab, anything? And then it's the food for 3. Does this extend? I mean, is there a hierarchy of, this is what I've been thinking about since you first mentioned it. Why does it ever break Shabbat to save a Torah? From what? You carry it out of the door or you run down the street. But is there a hierarchy of things? You have to save the lives, of course. You take the babies out. And then there's the Torah. And then there's the ritual objects. And then there's now food for 3 days. Is there some hierarchy of what is important to save that we think about all year, especially as wildfires threaten us here? I mean, that's where my head went.
Good. Irene is asking exactly the right questions, which is we're being forced to ask what is essential. And we ask this question in some theoretical, what would you save from a burning building? What's the one object, right? This is like often a hypothetical. What is your most precious object? What would you save? Would you save your computer? Would you save your tefillin? Would you save pictures? But now the rabbis are asking that question, and they're giving us some examples, but pictures aren't on there. Computers not on there. What's on there is obviously life, but then holy objects and enough food to survive for a day. Seems like not enough. Irene was also asking, what is it really? What's the violation of Shabbat here? Again, we're just presuming that there is some violation of Shabbat, that you have to put out the fire, or you have to violate Shabbat in some way in order to do this. Okay. I mean, you're supposed to not even touch fire on Shabbat, because touching fire can be a way of causing it to burn further, right? Like adding air or motion to it. So just presuming that it involves a Shabbat violation, what's on that list of most essential things? And why are 3 meals on that list? Okay. All right, let's keep thinking about this. I've seen Yael's hand up for a while. Hi, Yael.
I'm having a hard time with this. I've got myself muted and I'm going, what? Because if you put out the fire, which you're not allowed to do supposedly on Shabbat, you might be preserving someone's home, and it might lead to the family's demise if you don't save the home. And also the fire will spread, as we've seen in wildfires, to other homes. So I would think that breaking the Shabbat at the beginning of the fire, as soon as you see it, and trying to put it out, throw water on it, would be the most life-preserving thing you could do.
Okay. Thank you, Yael. I'm so glad that we've arrived at this point, that Yael has brought us to this very important question, because save a life for Shabbat. Everybody's on board, right? Like that sounds like a great law. We're save a Torah too. Wow, impressed. So we really like our books around here. But now this law is a little different. It's like only save as much as you need to get through. Can we just eliminate danger on Shabbat? A fire starts. I'll tell you a story about this, actually. I remember actually when I was, in my 20s, and I was at a Shabbat. I was there with my brother. And it was like a group of young people, and it was like a potluck, and it was a little chaotic. And the Shabbat candles started a fire. There was suddenly something caught on fire, like some piece of paper, and all of a sudden there was like a blaze in the middle of the living room. And my brother, God bless him, just picked it up and ran to the sink and turned on the sink. And some guy, I'll never forget his comment, no, you're not supposed to put out a fire on Shabbat. And my brother just looked at him and was like, shut up. And then immediately, put it out. And thank God. And also clearly my brother was right. And yet this other guy who I won't name was trying to latch on to something here that Yael is also struggling with, which is there some idea that there's a certain extent to which we should just let it burn? And is that a good law? I mean, we were so pleased with the permissions, but here it seems like there are some very severe lines being drawn. So in order to address Yael's concern, let's take a look at the next Mishnah where we begin to see. So we started with saving life, hooray. And then now we're pulling back a little bit and creating some restrictions around violating Shabbat. So let's take a look at the next Mishnah where just as quickly, it seems the rabbis are stepping in with, I don't know if I would call this a loophole, but we're heading in that direction. Take a look at the next Mishnah. The next Mishnah is, now you can, however, you can only rescue for 3 meals, but the next Mishnah says, you can rescue a basket full of loaves from a fire on Shabbat. So you don't have to extract the 3 meals from the basket. If they're all in one basket, you just take it. And even if there's food for 100 meals in it, or a round cake of dried figs, that was like a way they stored figs. So a big bunch of figs, you don't have to take 3 figs, right? You take the whole cake of figs, or a barrel full of wine. Okay, so now it seems like, okay, you could just grab stuff. And the idea is you're grabbing for your 3 meals, but you don't have to worry about separating it out. You can be more practical. And it seems you can end up taking 100 meals worth out of stuff. That's a pretty major amendment to the law we just read. And then take a look at this. This is it's a time of anti-Semitism in the world. So I wouldn't want anti-Semites to see this next law because it's so fits into their picture of something I celebrate, which is the workaround, the crafty rabbinic mind. But take a look at what they say here. This is such a good example of it. And one may say to others, come and rescue for yourselves. Meaning everybody can take 3 meals. Let's all go in. Everybody can, we have a rule. We can all take 3 meals. So everybody run in and take 3 meals and you end up saving the whole house. And then it says, and if they are clever, they make a calculation with him after Shabbat. This is such a great line, folks. This is really one for the record books, but again, not to share with our anti-Semitic friends, not friends. If they are clever, they make a calculation after Shabbat. In other words, talk about a loophole. We can get everybody to come in and take stuff. We're really only supposed to take 3 meals out, but everybody can come and take stuff. And then if they're smart, they'll say, okay, I got some stuff from you. You want to pay me a little bit and I'll give you your stuff, right? Okay. So there's all sorts of deals happening, but all sorts of workarounds to make sure that actually everything gets out of the house. So here's a response to Yael's concern, what's going on here? Could we really just allow a fire to burn, right? Like this guy that my brother shoved away wanted us to? Or are the rabbis pointing to the same sensitivity that Yael has, that in the end, we got to make sure Shabbat is not something that devastates all of our property, our lives, right? Yael framed it in terms of, well, every fire is danger. And that's a good argument. But this is a little different. This is like, well, surely we can get everything out if we try. Okay. Let's return to see what folks are thinking here. Payam?
I mean, this is sort of the way that we're thinking about it is weird because there's a reason you don't do these things on Shabbat. So if that reason doesn't apply anymore, then shouldn't you be able to do it? I mean, there's a reason these prohibitions exist. They're not just willy-nilly prohibitions because God said so. There should be some logic behind the prohibitions.
Yeah, I mean, that really brings us to an important question, what Payam's asking. Payam's saying, look, let's just think about what are the values underlying this system? If one of the values is the preservation of life or property or tranquility, the whole point of this stuff is that you don't, that you want to preserve life and shalom and well-being. So let's just ask that, like, it's not so complicated, is it? In fact, in a way, the way Payam's framing it, it's like pushing aside Shabbat is not really pushing aside Shabbat. It's within the principles of Shabbat that one saves life. So let's just ask, what are the underlying reasons? And I think that is a good point. And I also want to respond by saying, I think part of the dilemma here is that Shabbat, we can come up with reasons for it, but it's a good example of something that we're doing, we're practicing, we're keeping in an irrational way. In other words, it's a strange thing to not be able to do any of these things once a week, to shut down your entire life once a week. There are reasons, but they're not reasons grounded in human need. I mean, yes, we can start, the human need for rest, but there's something about the observance of these mitzvot, Shabbat and others, that suggests that sometimes we do things even though they don't make sense. And so how far do we take that? I mean, there are lots of ways, I've definitely been like in a dark room on Shabbat where I forgot to turn on the light and Shabbat is setting and I'm like, and it's cold and I'm suffering a little bit because it's irrational. I'm not actually enjoying Shabbat. And yet there's a way in which I can suffer through this, I'll live with the irrational a little bit. So I think that's the line we're playing with here is, can we suspend our religious obligations, which after all, maybe don't make a lot of intuitive human sense? Can we suspend them for needs that do make a lot of intuitive human sense? Or no, are there some, because after all, I know I shouldn't kill someone, to save my life. That makes sense. And I don't want to sleep with my family members. But when it comes to idolatry, if you put a gun to my head, yeah, I'd like to be able to bow down to the idol. That seems like not worth sacrificing for. And yet there's some notion in Jewish law that no, you do act irrationally sometimes for the sake of some higher principle, right? So that is part of what's at stake here. Okay, let's see if we can take a few more thoughts. Jen?
Yeah, I think I'm approaching this from almost a photo-negative perspective, and that's helping me a little bit. And that is, instead of looking at these things as exceptions to Shabbat, just in and of themselves, how do these things facilitate the purpose of Shabbat, right? If we say one of the things we want to do on Shabbat, we're to be in the presence of or connected to the divine. If there's something about that bringing us in alignment with the divine, we have to be alive to do it. We save those things that most profoundly, existentially, and in a sacred way connect us to the divine, like a Torah scroll. And God nourishes us. That is one of the things that God has done in the Torah, is provide us with food. These things all make sense to me, not so much as exceptions to Shabbat, but as facilitations of and even enactments of Shabbat.
Good. That's great. That's a great, Payam makes this I think bolsters Payam's point, and I had kind of pushed back on it a little bit, but Jen pushes back again and says, I don't need to come up with the practical basic. It's this is part of what it means to keep Shabbat. You need to be alive to keep Shabbat. You need to eat to keep Shabbat. You need a Torah to keep Shabbat. All these things are necessary for Shabbat. It's within the logic of the system, which is part of what Payam was saying as well. But Jen says that it's you can't contradict Shabbat in order to keep Shabbat. It's pretty straightforward, actually. Okay. let's see. I want to show you one more thing, and we're almost out of time. So let me show you an important last, this is like a couple chapters forward. And here's an important last exception or series of exceptions, one of which will seem very intuitive to us and will fit right into our conversation. And the last of which, a real famous example, doesn't as much. So let's take a look. Here now, we're jumping forward to chapter 18. And it says, one may not birth an animal even on a festival, meaning definitely not on Shabbat, and even on a festival which is slightly lesser stricture. But one may assist it to give birth. Okay, so I don't know enough about like animal husbandry and all those things to know what it means that you don't go into the full process of delivering a calf on Shabbat. But if there's a way in which you can facilitate that process to allow the cow to give birth herself, you can do that. Okay. Remember, we were worried about animals before, humans and animal life. So you can't go all the way for an animal, but you can help a little bit. And then, of course, one may birth a woman even on Shabbat, festival or Shabbat. For sure, you can not just help, but you can do the delivery, and even can call a midwife for her to travel from place to place. And now we're starting to see what I was saying earlier. It's not just that you can give the medicine, you can drive to the hospital, and not just the person who is in physical danger, but the support for that person. For one may desecrate Shabbat for a woman giving birth. And the language here is quite strange. Umechalelin aleha et Shabbat. For her sake, you violate Shabbat. Okay. And similarly, one may tie the umbilical cord of a child born on Shabbat. You're not allowed to tie knots on Shabbat. Or even to cut the umbilical cord. Oh, this piece belongs up here. So all of these violations around birth, you can do. And again, good. And it's not so hard to see why. It's actually, we don't have time, but it's a more interesting question. Why do they need to mention this separately? Giving birth is a life-threatening situation, so that should take care of that. But maybe the answer is, you might think, oh, just wait, she'll live. Like if we delay the labor another 24 hours. But no, don't do that, okay? I'm out of time, but I want to give you the last example as a way of leaving us with a thought to consider. And the last example is a famous one, because I don't think it falls into the category of pikuach nefesh, which, a woman giving birth so clearly does. And that is, and all the requirements of circumcision may be performed on Shabbat. Now, this is a famous law because it's famous because it seems like an exception. That's not saving a life. In fact, and if anything, there's a little bloodletting involved, right? So why can you do that? And that's sort of the question that I want to end with here, though we hardly have time. There's a technical reason, which the Talmud gives, which is that it says, Uvayom hashmini. It says on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. So it's like, it's the 8th day. It has to be on the 8th. Torah says it has to be on the 8th day. So that's all there is to it. But it isn't saving a life. It's a ritual need. And now we've arrived at a question I wish we had more time to discuss. But so far, we've been looking at what kinds of dangers or needs do we have in order to just preserve enough life and sustenance that will keep Shabbat going. But here we've arrived at a new question, which is, what religious obligations push aside other religious obligations, right? And that's a different question. That's a distinct question. I'm going to take one last comment. We're almost out of time, but I'd love to hear from Derek, who I haven't heard from yet.
Okay, I feel scared to be the last word, but
I'll be I always keep talking.
Okay. I'll bring a kind of, I'm trained in the law, though I haven't practiced law. And the law doesn't like to make rules telling people how to break the rules. So I think that the thing that's interesting here is that it's like what you said about anti-Semitism. Would you like a religion that said that had a law that said, it's a good thing on your most holiest day to preserve all of your possessions, right? What is the affirmative of that law? Someone said negative photograph, positive photograph, because if you create a positive affirmative action that you're able to take, that becomes a law, a principle of your religion. So you can't really have a principle of your religion that says your possessions are so important that they trump Shabbat. And so I think we actually want the opposite to be the case, is that Shabbat should make us reflect on the fact that our possessions aren't important except for the Torah in our life, right? And so I think that's not a cruel rule. It's like, your house actually doesn't matter. You know, you can build another house. Like someone once said to me when I lost a job, they said, you know, the only thing you can't get back is time, but money you can make more of, right? And so I think that's sort of the principle. You can build another house. You can't build another life, right? So I think that's what I was thinking.
Good. Okay, good. So these are, obviously we're not going to wrap this all up and we have to stop now, but these are a couple, Derek gives us a couple of important counterpoint, tension points to consider as we leave this conversation. On the one hand, you know, what we're clearly seeing here is that pragmatism, and more than pragmatism, but like a respect for the basic needs of human life and society, is part of the conversation here. The rabbis were not extremists to the extent that they would not consider the sometimes need to suspend religious obligations. And so we're seeing that rabbinic tendency, we're seeing that as a fundamental principle within the religion. But on the other hand, there are some red lines here. And the idea is not simply, don't worry about it. If you have a countervailing need, you can break Shabbat. No, Shabbat is important. And it's so important that sometimes you have to suffer some inconvenience, if not loss, real serious loss, because it's Shabbat and there are sacrifices that must be made. The question is, what cannot be sacrificed and what can? And we're kind of playing with that here. And I guess I'll just close by saying, and I want you thinking about, why circumcision? It seemed like surely that could be pushed off another day. And here we're entering into another conversation, as I said, which is, okay, but now we've got colliding obligations, and how do we balance the two? How do we rank? We've been doing kind of ranking, prioritizing. How do we rank our possessions? How do we rank our religious obligations? How do we figure this all out? And that is, after all, the work of the Mishnah, and the Talmud is figuring all this out. So we've done a good job of it today. We'll do one more session on Shabbat next week, and we're going to take a look at the case of the Shabbos, the famous case of the Shabbos Goy, and where that comes from. So come back next week, and we'll try to close out our discussion of Shabbat and then move on to the other holidays. Thanks for being with me, you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.
Shabbat Tov to you all. Shabbat Tov.